The Ikko-Ikki, Japan's rebel monks who fought the samurai. Imagine this. The year is 1570. Japan's most powerful warlord, Oda Nobunaga, stands before a massive fortress temple surrounded by water. Inside, thousands of warrior monks armed with guns, spears, and absolute faith prepare for battle. These aren't ordinary monks meditating in peace. They're farmers, merchants, and priests who've united under one banner to challenge the samurai class itself. For the next 10 years, Nobunaga, the man who would nearly unify all of Japan, will throw everything he has at this fortress. And he'll fail. Again and again. Who were these warrior monks who brought the mighty samurai to their knees? This is the story of the Ikko-Ikki, the single deadliest rebellion in feudal Japan. Hit that subscribe button if you want more content like this. It takes 1 second and helps to support this channel. Before we dive in, let's get one thing straight. The Ikko-Ikki weren't just monks. That's the common misconception. According to historical records, the Ikko-Ikki were a massive coalition of different groups: peasant farmers, local merchants, minor nobles, and yes, Buddhist monks, all united by their devotion to a specific branch of Buddhism called Jodo Shinshu, true Pure Land Buddhism. The name Ikko-Ikki itself tells you everything. Ikko means single-minded or devoted to one thing. Ikki means uprising or riot. Put them together and you get the single-minded uprising. People so devoted to their faith that they take up arms against the ruling samurai class. This wasn't a small movement. At their peak, the Ikko-Ikki controlled entire provinces. They built fortress temples that rivaled military castles. They fielded armies tens of thousands strong. And for over a century, from roughly 1460 to 1580, they were one of the most powerful military and political forces in Japan. But their story begins much earlier, with one man and one revolutionary idea about Buddhism. Part 1. The birth of a movement. The religious revolution. To understand the Ikko-Ikki, we need to travel back to the 1200s, when a monk named Shinran started a religious revolution that would change Japan forever. Traditional Buddhism in Japan at that time was complicated and expensive. You needed education to read the sutras, the holy texts written in Chinese characters. You needed money to pay for ceremonies and donations to temples. You needed time to meditate and study. For the average farmer working from sunrise to sunset just to survive, this kind of Buddhism was simply out of reach. Shinran changed all of that with one simple teaching. You don't need fancy ceremonies, expensive donations, or years of meditation to reach enlightenment. All you need is faith. Just recite the name of Amida Buddha, Namu Amida Butsu, with genuine belief, and you'll be saved. According to Buddhist tradition, Amida Buddha made a vow that anyone who sincerely called upon his name would be reborn in the Pure Land, a paradise where reaching enlightenment would be easy. Shinran taught that this vow was so powerful, and Amida's compassion so great, that even the worst sinner could be saved. You didn't have to be a scholar or a saint. You could be a farmer, a soldier, even a criminal. Your faith alone was enough. This message spread like wildfire among common people. For the first time, Buddhism wasn't just for the elite. It was for everyone. Enter Renyo, the revolutionary organizer. But the real architect of the Ikko-Ikki movement came 2 centuries later. His name was Renyo, and he lived from 1415 to 1499. Historical records describe Renyo as a brilliant organizer and charismatic preacher. He took Shinran's teachings and built them into something more, a mass movement with political and military power. Renyo was born into trouble. He was the son of the Honganji temple's abbot, Honganji being the headquarters of the Jodo Shinshu sect. But at that time, Honganji was just another small temple struggling to survive. The powerful monastery on Mount Hiei, home to warrior monks of the rival Tendai sect, saw Jodo Shinshu as a threat. They wanted it crushed. In 1465, warrior monks from Mount Hiei attacked Honganji and burned it to the ground. Renyo barely escaped with his life. This attack changed everything. Renyo realized that if his movement was going to survive, followers needed to be able to defend themselves. So he began organizing them into communities called Keiō, religious fraternities where believers supported each other, prayed together, and when necessary, fought together. Renyo traveled throughout Japan, establishing these communities and spreading his message. He was a gifted writer who composed letters in simple Japanese that ordinary people could read. Archaeological evidence from temple records shows these letters were copied thousands of times and distributed throughout the country. His message was both spiritual and political. All believers are equal before Amida Buddha. It didn't matter if you were a peasant or a lord. In the eyes of the Buddha, everyone had the same worth. This was revolutionary in a society strictly divided by class, where samurai ruled and peasants served. Renyo's teaching gave common people a sense of dignity and unity they'd never had before. The first uprising, the transformation from religious movement to military force, happened gradually and suddenly. In the province of Kaga, on the northern coast of Japan, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism had become extremely popular among the local population. The province was ruled by a powerful samurai family, but by 1470, most of the common people, and even some lower-ranking samurai, had converted to the faith. Tensions rose between the ruling class and these true Pure Land believers. The samurai lords imposed harsh taxes and treated the Buddhist communities with suspicion and contempt. The believers, unified by their faith and growing in confidence, began to resist. Then in 1488, something unprecedented happened. According to historical chronicles, when the military governor of Kaga tried to suppress the Jodo Shinshu communities, they rose up against him. Peasants, merchants, minor nobles, and monks joined forces. They weren't just a mob. They were organized, disciplined, and united by their faith. The rebellion succeeded. The governor was overthrown and killed. And for the next century, Kaga Province would be governed not by samurai lords, but by councils of true Pure Land believers. Think about how shocking this was. In a country where the samurai warrior class had ruled for centuries, where social hierarchy was seen as the natural order of things, peasants and monks had just overthrown their rulers and taken control of an entire province. This was the birth of the Ikko-Ikki as a political and military force. And it was just the beginning. Part 2. The Fortress Temples. Building a Buddhist state. Once the Ikko-Ikki controlled Kaga, they had to figure out how to govern it. What they created was unique in Japanese history. A state run by religious communities rather than feudal lords. Power was decentralized. Local temples became centers of both religious and political authority. Councils of believers made decisions collectively. The provincial administration was handled by representatives from different temple communities working together. This wasn't pure democracy. Certain prominent temple leaders had more influence, but compared to the authoritarian rule of samurai lords, it was remarkably participatory. Archaeological evidence from the period shows that the Ikko-Ikki in Kaga collected taxes at lower rates in neighboring provinces under samurai control. They also invested in irrigation projects and infrastructure that benefited farmers directly. For common people in Kaga, life under Ikko-Ikki rule was often better than life under the samurai. The cathedral fortresses. But the Ikko-Ikki knew their experiment wouldn't last unless they could defend it. So they built some of the most impressive military fortifications in Japan. Fortress temples that served as both religious centers and military strongholds. The greatest of these was Ishiyama Honganji in Osaka. Ishiyama Honganji wasn't just a temple. It was a massive castle city built on a plateau overlooking Osaka Bay, protected on 3 sides by rivers and moats. Historical accounts describe walls 30 feet high, guard towers equipped with guns, and storehouses filled with enough rice and weapons to withstand years of siege. Inside the walls lived thousands of people, monks, warriors, craftsmen, merchants, and their families. The main temple building was enormous, capable of holding thousands of worshippers. Surrounding it were barracks, armories, foundries for casting bullets, workshops for making gunpowder, and even farms and gardens to provide food during sieges. Modern historians have compared Ishiyama Honganji to European castle cities of the same period. It combined religious, military, and economic functions in one fortified complex. And it would become the headquarters of the Ikko-Ikki movement, where their leader, the chief abbot of Honganji, directed the struggle against the samurai lords, the warrior monks. So, who actually did the fighting for the Ikko-Ikki? First, let's clear up that term, warrior monks. In Japanese, they're called Sohei, and they'd existed in Japan for centuries before the Ikko-Ikki. Major Buddhist monasteries, like those on Mount Hiei, had maintained armed forces to protect their lands and interests since the 900s. But the Ikko-Ikki were different. Their fighting forces were much more diverse than traditional Sohei. Yes, there were actual monks, men who'd taken religious vows, but also trained in combat. Historical records describe them wearing distinctive white robes over their armor and carrying banners with sacred inscriptions. But the majority of Ikko-Ikki warriors were samurai, minor samurai, and peasant fighters. These were farmers and townsfolk who believed in the true Pure Land teachings. They didn't fight as a profession. They farmed their land or ran their businesses most of the year. But when their faith or their communities were threatened, they took up arms. Archaeological evidence from battle sites shows the weapons they used: spears, bows, swords, and increasingly, guns. The Ikko-Ikki were quick to adopt firearms after Portuguese traders introduced them to Japan in the 1540s. Ishiyama Honganji developed its own gunsmithing, workshops, and trained thousands of men to use the new weapons. What made Ikko-Ikki warriors particularly effective was their motivation. Samurai fought for honor, loyalty to their lord, and personal glory. Ikko-Ikki fought for their faith, their families, and their freedom from samurai oppression. According to accounts from the period, they went into battle chanting Namu Amida Butsu, believing that if they died fighting for the Buddha's cause, they'd be reborn in the Pure Land. This religious fervor made them fearless and willing to fight to the death. Part 3. The Enemy's Circle. Why the samurai hated them. To the samurai class, the Ikko-Ikki represented everything wrong with the world. First, they challenged the social order. In the rigid hierarchy of feudal Japan, everyone had their place. Samurai ruled and fought. Peasants farmed. Merchants traded. Monks prayed. The idea that peasants and monks could band together, take up arms, and overthrow their rightful rulers was deeply threatening to samurai authority everywhere. Second, they threatened the economic system. Samurai lords depended on taxes from farmers and merchants to support their armies and lifestyles. When provinces fell under Ikko-Ikki control, those tax revenues disappeared. Even worse, provinces neighboring Ikko-Ikki territories saw their own peasants questioning why they should pay higher taxes to samurai lords when they could have more autonomy under religious communities. Third, many samurai saw the Ikko-Ikki as religiously dangerous. Other Buddhist sects, especially the powerful Tendai and Nichiren schools, viewed Jodo Shinshu's egalitarian message as heretical. They pressured samurai lords to suppress the movement. Finally, there was simple self-interest. The provinces controlled by the Ikko-Ikki were often rich and strategically valuable. Ambitious warlords wanted to conquer them, not because they cared about religious orthodoxy, but because they wanted the land, the taxes, and the ports. The bloody conflicts. Throughout the 1500s, the Ikko-Ikki fought a series of brutal wars against various samurai lords. In 1506, Ikko-Ikki forces in Kaga defeated an army led by the Asakura clan, one of the most powerful samurai families in central Japan. Historical records describe a battle where Ikko-Ikki, warriors used their knowledge of local terrain to ambush and destroy a samurai force twice their size. In 1532, the Ikko-Ikki besieged and burned down the Kyoto temple complex of a rival Buddhist sect that had allied with the shogun against them. This attack shocked the nation because of its ferocity. The Ikko-Ikki showed they wouldn't hesitate to use violence even against other Buddhist schools. In 1570, Ikko-Ikki forces in the region around Osaka defeated Oda Nobunaga's army at the Battle of Noda and Fukushima. This was particularly significant because Nobunaga was already recognized as one of the most brilliant military commanders in Japan, and the Ikko-Ikki had just handed him a humiliating defeat. These weren't isolated incidents. According to scholarly estimates, the Ikko-Ikki were involved in hundreds of battles, sieges, and skirmishes throughout the 1500s. They won many of these conflicts, establishing a military reputation that commanded respect and fear. The political web, but the Ikko-Ikki didn't survive through military might alone. They were also skilled at political maneuvering. The period from roughly 1467 to 1603 is called the Sengoku Zidai, the age of warring states. Japan was fragmented into dozens of territories controlled by competing warlords. There was no strong central government. Alliances shifted constantly. Everyone was trying to expand their power at everyone else's expense. The Ikko-Ikki played this game skillfully. Records show they sometimes teamed up with warlords for a short time when it helped them. They traded with merchant guilds. They negotiated with the imperial court in Kyoto. They even coordinated with other Ikko-Ikki communities in different provinces to present a united front. The chief abbot of Honganji, who was both the spiritual leader of Jodo Shinshu Buddhism and the political leader of the Ikko-Ikki movement, conducted diplomacy like a feudal lord. He sent ambassadors, arranged marriages between prominent Ikko-Ikki families and sympathetic samurai clans, and manipulated the complex web of alliances to keep his enemies divided. For decades, this strategy worked. The Ikko-Ikki remained powerful and independent, controlling key territories and influencing events throughout Japan. But everything changed when one man decided to unify Japan, no matter the cost. Part 4. The Demon King. Enter Oda Nobunaga. If you know anything about samurai history, you've heard of Oda Nobunaga. He's one of the most famous figures in Japanese history. Brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely determined to unite Japan under his rule. Born in 1534, Nobunaga was the son of a minor warlord. Through military genius, political cunning, and sheer audacity, he rose to become the most powerful man in Japan. By 1560, he defeated much larger armies through innovative tactics. By 1568, he'd seized control of Kyoto and installed a puppet shogun who served his interests. But Nobunaga wasn't just ambitious. He was also deeply hostile to Buddhism, especially to religious institutions that held political and military power. Historical accounts describe him as a pragmatist with little patience for religious authority that challenged himself. In 1571, Nobunaga did something that shocked all of Japan. He attacked Mount Hiei, one of the most sacred sites in Japanese Buddhism, home to thousands of monks and the Tendai sect's headquarters. His forces surrounded the mountain and set it ablaze. According to contemporary accounts, which may be exaggerated, but were widely believed, Nobunaga's army killed between 3,000 and 20,000 people, including monks, women, and children. The message was clear. Nobunaga would not tolerate religious institutions that opposed him. Not even the most sacred temples would be spared. And the Ikko-Ikki were next. The first clashes. Nobunaga's conflict with the Ikko-Ikki began in the 1560s in the provinces around his home base. Local Ikko-Ikki communities opposed his expansion. and Nobunaga responded with typical ruthlessness, burning their temples and slaughtering anyone who resisted. But these were just skirmishes. The real war began in 1570, when Nobunaga demanded that Kenyo Kosa, the chief abbot of Honganji and leader of the Ikko-Ikki, submit to his authority. Kenyo refused. He was in a difficult position. As the spiritual leader of millions of Jodo Shinshu believers throughout Japan, he couldn't simply surrender without betraying his followers. He also understood that if Nobunaga unified Japan, the independence and power of the Ikko-Ikki would be finished. This was a fight for survival. So Kenyo issued a call to arms. Historical records show that he sent letters to Ikko-Ikki communities throughout Japan, urging them to resist Nobunaga. He formed alliances with other warlords who opposed Nobunaga's expansion, and he prepared Ishiyama Honganji for the siege he knew was coming. The 10-Year War. What followed was one of the longest and bloodiest campaigns in Japanese history. Nobunaga's first major offensive came in 1570. He led a large army to Osaka to attack Ishiyama Honganji directly. But the fortress temple proved nearly impossible to capture. Its walls were too strong, its position too defensible, and the defenders too motivated. The Ikko-Ikki also controlled the rivers and the bay around Osaka. They used boats to bring in supplies and reinforcements, preventing Nobunaga from completely surrounding the fortress. According to historical accounts, the Ikko-Ikki had a fleet of hundreds of ships, some armed with guns and even primitive cannon, that repeatedly broke through Nobunaga's naval blockades. Nobunaga tried different strategies. He built his own navy and fortified ports to cut off Ishiyama Honganji's supply lines. He constructed siege castles surrounding the fortress to maintain constant pressure. He bribed Ikko-Ikki leaders to defect. He burned villages and temples that supported the defenders, trying to break their will. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, Ikko-Ikki forces throughout Japan launched attacks against Nobunaga's territories and allies. In 1574, Ikko-Ikki warriors in the northern provinces ambushed and destroyed one of Nobunaga's armies. In 1576, they coordinated a multi-front offensive that forced Nobunaga to fight on several fronts simultaneously. The war consumed enormous resources. Both sides spent fortunes on weapons, supplies, and mercenaries. Thousands died in battles, sieges, and raids. Agricultural production in the regions around Osaka collapsed as armies ravaged the countryside. And still, Ishiyama Honganji held out. The turning point. By 1576, Nobunaga realized he needed a new approach. He couldn't take Ishiyama Honganji by force, so he focused on isolating it. He constructed a chain of fortresses completely encircling the Ikko-Ikki stronghold. He commissioned the building of massive iron-plated warships, basically floating fortresses that could withstand the Ikko-Ikki's gun-armed boats. According to historical records, these warships, completed in 1578, were some of the first armored warships in world history, predating European ironclads by centuries. With these new warships, Nobunaga's forces defeated the Ikko-Ikki fleet in several naval battles and finally established an effective blockade. Supplies to Ishiyama Honganji slowed to a trickle. At the same time, Nobunaga's armies systematically destroyed Ikko-Ikki power bases throughout Japan. One by one, fortress temples fell. Villages that supported the Ikko-Ikki were burned. Leaders were hunted down and killed. The Ikko-Ikki were being strangled. Part 5. The Fall. The siege grinds on. By 1580, conditions inside Ishiyama Honganji were desperate. The fortress had been under siege for a decade. Food supplies were running low. Medicine was scarce. Disease spread through the crowded fortress city. And with the naval blockade in place, no relief was coming. Abbot Kenyo faced an impossible choice. He could fight on, condemning the thousands of men, women, and children inside Ishiyama Honganji to slow starvation or a final suicidal battle. Or he could surrender, accepting the destruction of everything the Ikko-Ikki had built over the past century. He tried to find a third option. According to historical records, Kenyo sent ambassadors to other warlords, begging for military assistance. He appealed to the imperial court in Kyoto to mediate peace. He even reached out to temples of other Buddhist sects, asking them to pressure Nobunaga to offer reasonable terms. Nothing worked. Nobunaga's other enemies were too weak or too cautious to help. The imperial court was powerless. And other Buddhist sects, remembering how the Ikko-Ikki had burned their temples decades earlier, had no sympathy. The Ikko-Ikki were alone. The Great Surrender. In the 8th month of 1580, Abbot Kenyo opened negotiations with Nobunaga. The terms were harsh. Ishiyama Honganji would be completely evacuated. Kenyo and his family would relocate far from Osaka, and the fortress temple itself would be surrendered to Nobunaga's forces. In exchange, Nobunaga agreed not to massacre the defenders and to allow Jodo Shinshu Buddhism to continue under strict supervision. Kenyo accepted, but not everyone agreed with this decision. According to contemporary accounts, a faction of hardline defenders, led by Kenyo's own son, refused to surrender. They believed that giving up Ishiyama Honganji betrayed everything the Ikko-Ikki stood for. Some argued that they should fight to the last person, achieving martyrdom rather than submission. These hardliners temporarily seized control of the fortress. Kenyo and those who supported surrender were forced to leave. For several more months, the die-hards held out, hoping for some miracle that would save them. No miracle came. In the 8th month of 1580, some historical sources say early 1581, the remaining defenders finally evacuated Ishiyama Honganji. As they left, they set fire to the fortress temple, destroying it rather than letting it fall intact into Nobunaga's hands. Historical records describe an enormous blaze visible for miles, consuming the greatest fortress temple in Japan. When Nobunaga's forces entered the ruins, they found nothing but ashes and scorched stones. The war was over. The Ikko-Ikki had lost. The aftermath. Nobunaga didn't stop with Ishiyama Honganji. Over the next 2 years, his armies hunted down remaining Ikko-Ikki resistance throughout Japan. In 1582, Nobunaga finally conquered Kaga Province, ending a century of Ikko-Ikki self-government. Historical accounts describe brutal reprisals, temples burned, leaders executed, and populations forcibly disarmed. But Nobunaga's victory was incomplete. In June 1582, just 2 years after Ishiyama Honganji's fall, Nobunaga was betrayed by one of his own generals and forced to commit suicide. He never lived to see Japan fully unified. That task would fall to his successors, Toyotomi Hideyoshi and later Tokugawa Ieyasu. Both continued Nobunaga's policies of suppressing religious military power. Hideyoshi conducted nationwide sword hunts, confiscating weapons from peasants to prevent future uprisings. Ieyasu, who finally unified Japan in 1603, kept Buddhist institutions under strict government control. The age of warrior monks was over. Part 6. The Legacy. What happened to Jodo Shinshu? You might think that after such a devastating defeat, Jodo Shinshu Buddhism would disappear. It didn't. In fact, it survived and eventually flourished. Today, Jodo Shinshu is one of the largest Buddhist denominations in Japan, with millions of followers worldwide. How did this happen? After Ishiyama Honganji fell, the Tokugawa shogunate, the military government that ruled Japan from 1603 to 1868, decided that Buddhism could be useful for social control. They required every family in Japan to register with a Buddhist temple, effectively making Buddhism part of the state apparatus. Jodo Shinshu temples were allowed to be rebuilt, but under strict conditions. They had to give up all military power. They had to accept government supervision, and they had to focus purely on spiritual matters, abandoning political activism. The Honganji organization split into two branches: Nishi, west, Honganji, and Higashi, east, Honganji, both based in Kyoto. These institutions still exist today. If you visit Kyoto, you can see their massive temple complexes, monuments to the faith that once fielded armies against the samurai. But the Ikko-Ikki themselves, the warrior monks and peasant soldiers who fought for religious freedom and social justice, were gone forever. The movement that had terrified samurai lords for over a century was reduced to stories and legends. The historical significance. So why should we care about the Ikko-Ikki today? What makes their story important beyond just being an interesting historical footnote? First, the Ikko-Ikki represents one of the most successful popular resistance movements in pre-modern history. They weren't just a peasant uprising that lasted a few months and then got crushed. They controlled territory, governed provinces, and influenced Japanese politics for over a century. That's remarkable. Second, they challenged the fundamental social structure of feudal Japan. In a rigidly hierarchical society, where peasants were expected to obey and samurai were born to rule, the Ikko-Ikki argued that faith made everyone equal. This religious egalitarianism was genuinely revolutionary, even if it wasn't a modern democratic movement by our standards. Third, the Ikko-Ikki demonstrated how religion and politics can intertwine, sometimes with positive results, sometimes with tragic ones. The movement provided dignity and community to common people who had little of either. It also led to devastating wars that killed tens of thousands and left entire regions in ruins. Fourth, the Ikko-Ikki showed that peasants and commoners, when organized and motivated, could fight effectively against professional warriors. The samurai class learned this lesson well, which is partly why later rulers like Hideyoshi and Ieyasu worked so hard to disarm the peasantry and keep religious institutions weak. Finally, the Ikko-Ikki are important because they're often forgotten. When people think of feudal Japan, they imagine samurai duels and noble lords, not peasant uprisings and warrior monks. But the Ikko-Ikki were just as much a part of that history. They shaped Japan's development as much as any famous samurai, remembering the warriors. Very few monuments commemorate the Ikko-Ikki today. Osaka Castle, built on the site of Ishiyama Honganji, barely mentions the fortress temple that once stood there. Most Japanese history textbooks give the Ikko-Ikki just a paragraph or two. The story has largely been buried. Some historians argue this is because the Ikko-Ikki's legacy is complicated. They fought for greater freedom and equality, which modern people can admire. But they also burned rival temples, killed prisoners, and fought with a religious fanaticism that makes people uncomfortable. Others point out that Japanese historical narratives have traditionally focused on the samurai class, because that's who wrote most of the historical records. Peasant movements like the Ikko-Ikki were documented primarily by their enemies, which means we see them through a hostile lens. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Ikko-Ikki were neither pure heroes fighting for justice, nor mindless fanatics. They were human beings, farmers, monks, merchants, and minor nobles, trying to protect their communities, their faith, and their autonomy in a violent age. They deserve to be remembered, not as villains or saints, but as what they were: ordinary people who did extraordinary things when their backs were against the wall. The fortress that became a castle. There's an interesting epilogue to this story. After Ishiyama Honganji burned to the ground, the site remained empty for several years. Then Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Nobunaga's successor, recognized its strategic value. In 1583, he began building a new fortress on the exact same spot where the Ikko-Ikki's greatest stronghold had stood. That fortress became Osaka Castle, one of the most famous castles in Japan, still standing today. Osaka Castle would play its own dramatic role in Japanese history. It became the center of the Toyotomi clan's power. After Hideyoshi's death, it was besieged twice by Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces in 1614 and 1615. in battles that finally ended the age of warring states and established the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan for 250 years. It's almost poetic. The site that witnessed the Ikko-Ikki's a last stand against samurai domination became the stage for the final battles that established samurai rule over all of Japan. Today, millions of tourists visit Osaka Castle every year. Most have no idea they're walking on the ruins of Ishiyama Honganji, where warrior monks and peasant soldiers once defied the most powerful warlord in Japan for an entire decade. Final thoughts. The story of the Ikko-Ikki asks us to reconsider what we think we know about feudal Japan. It wasn't just samurai fighting samurai in honorable duels. It was also farmers with guns defending their temples, monks leading armies into battle, and common people claiming that they too had rights and dignity. The Ikko-Ikki proved that faith could be a powerful force for social change and for destruction. They showed that ordinary people, when organized and motivated, could challenge seemingly invincible power structures. And they demonstrated that even the most successful resistance movements can ultimately fail when facing a determined, ruthless, and resource-rich enemy. Their story ended in defeat and fire. But for over a century, they fought, and often won battles that everyone said they couldn't possibly win. The samurai called them rebels and fanatics. The true Pure Land believers called themselves defenders of the faith and their communities. History might call them the Ikko-Ikki, the single-minded uprising. But perhaps the best way to remember them is simpler. They were warriors who refused to bow. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Japanese history's most fascinating and forgotten stories, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more content about the hidden corners of history. What other forgotten warriors or rebellions do you want to hear about? Let me know in the comments. And remember, history isn't just about kings and famous generals. Sometimes the most interesting stories belong to the people everyone else forgot. Thanks for watching. Until next time, walk in peace.